Hi, everybody who's here already. Welcome on in. As is tradition with our Zoom webinars, we'll kick things off around 7:01 or 7:02. You know how it is when you try to join one of these things, you get the reminder from your phone and then Zoom wants to update. Takes a minute or so to actually get in once you get that 7 p.m. notification. So we'll give everyone a minute or two to file in and then we'll get started. How's it going, Tori?
It's going great.
The
As
beginning.
is traditional as well, we're matching once again. Both wearing corded black sweaters with five stripes.
Yeah, mine is technically navy, but I guess in this lighting you can't tell.
Ho, ho, ho.
This is the part where we make small talk as if we hadn't just talked 10 minutes ago. So everyone can enjoy the awkwardness of that.
I mean, you did change, I think, since last time I saw you, so
I did.
the outfits are always a surprise.
That's right. All right, we'll give everyone another minute or two to file in before we hit the ground running. If you've just joined us, we're going to start in a minute or two to give people a little more time to file in. Everyone is always a little bit late to Zoom webinars. So here we are. I can share a little bit of what was a funny story to me and Tori, but maybe not funny to anyone else in the world. There's a Facebook group that we're in for members of the National Test Prep Association. And a colleague of ours from Atlanta shared that there had been additional practice tests released in the Blue Book application this morning.
Oh my God.
So in addition to the 6 that are in there now, he announced that Blue Book's tests 7 and 8 had been added. Tori was extremely excited about that in our work Slack channel this morning because Tori looked at that without checking the calendar, realizing that today is April 1st. And there, in fact, are not 2 new Blue Book tests.
Oh
Blue Book has.
God. I was so excited, guys. It was all caps in the Slack channel. I was like, I was like, oh no, man. Ugh.
All right.
Nerds.
Yeah, exactly. Let's jump into the presentation now. So for those of you who don't know us, my name's Jim Wismer. I'm the director of IV Experience and a board member of the National Test Prep Association. And I'm joined by my colleague, Tori Burke, our assistant director of tutoring. And Tori and I oversee all of the test prep here at IV Experience, managing and training our tutoring team, getting families set up with plans to do test prep, matching families with tutors, all of that fun stuff. So we're here because this digital SAT has loomed large in our world for a very long time. We've been getting ready for this thing for basically 2 years, because while the title of this webinar is what we learned from the first digital SAT, in fact, the first digital SAT was about a year and a month ago internationally. This March was the first digital SAT in the United States. And because we are members of the National Test Prep Association at IV Experience, we have been in touch with our international colleagues. And so we're drawing on not just our experience from our own students from this past test date, but experience from our colleagues nationwide on the March test and experience from our international colleagues over the past year. So we're kind of speaking from the authority of not just what we've heard from our students, but even beyond that. And so a couple things that we can tell you up front. One thing that we really can't go past or sugarcoat is that the digital SAT is a higher variance test than the previous version of the paper SAT or than the ACT. And the easiest way to understand this is simply the question count of the tests. So the digital SAT has less than half as many questions as the ACT. And the paper SAT is about 50% longer than the digital SAT. And this leads to a situation where every question matters more. And this is just kind of obvious by looking at it. The scoring system didn't change. It's still out of 1,600. So if you think of each question as kind of containing a percentage of that score, which isn't exactly how the scoring works, but is kind of an easy way to understand the scoring, then you can see that a question on the digital SAT is much more impactful than one question on the paper SAT. And that means that every, curveball that the test throws at you that you weren't quite prepared for, every lucky guess or unlucky, silly mistake or anything like that is going to have an undue effect compared to what we're used to seeing from the paper SAT. So this is something that a lot of students saw, results that they were not quite ready for, some on the low end, some on the high end, and we're expecting that to continue to some extent because the results just will vary more on this test because small swings will make a bigger difference. The other thing about this digital SAT is that there are variable question weights. So the digital SAT has actually experimental questions built into the test. So in fact, you could subtract 8 from that question count because 8 of those questions will be experimental questions. And so essentially, if you get one question wrong in the digital SAT, it could be -0 points from your score because it could be an experimental question. And we've seen a single question make as much of a difference as 40 points. And that would be rare, and that's the very highest we've ever seen. More common is going to be 10 or 20 and sometimes 30. But we have seen a 40-point swing on a student answering one question correctly or incorrectly, at least in the scoring of the Blue Book practice test, which is really all we have to go on because the College Board has no transparency on the grading of the official test. But on the Blue Book practice tests, we can go in, answer a certain way, see what the score is, change one answer and see what the score is. So these variable question weights are going to mean that unlucky mistake, you could just totally get away with it, or it could have a massive impact on your score. And then the variable difficulties between modules are a potential extra source of variance, but really only for students who are on the cusp of that easier or harder second module, which is going to be somewhere in the high 400s to low 500s most of the time. But I should note that that's not really based on your score. So usually that's the range where we're seeing students could have one or the other, but the true range is actually wider than that. So with all of that said, it's important for us to just talk about the difficulty of the official exam versus the difficulty of the Blue Book practice tests, because this is something we heard universally from students. And so based on student reports nationwide, the first modules and the easier second modules of reading and writing were about equal to what students were seeing on the Blue Book practice tests. But the harder second modules were harder. And in reading and writing, those harder second modules were a little bit harder than what they saw. And the harder math second modules, students reported, were much harder than what they saw on the Blue Book practice tests. So I had a student I was working with who scored an 800 on the third Blue Book practice test the week before the test. And he ran out of time for several questions on the math of the official test after not running out of time for a single math question on the Blue Book practice test. And that time difficulty is a big piece of what we'll talk about in the difference between these tests. But this is, it appears, the new reality, because we've heard reports that the October SAT and the December SAT had this same difficulty level that students saw in March. So it's probably true that the official tests are going to consistently be more difficult than the Blue Book practice tests that College Board has released. And so the question becomes, how do we respond to that? Before we go there, Tori's going to tell us about kind of how these Blue Book tests stack up against one another.
Yeah, so the Blue Book difficulty varies like pretty wildly depending on the test. These first 3 tests, pretty much in descending order, so 3, 2, 1, are significantly easier than the last 3.
And that's with 3 being the easiest, just to clarify.
Yes. Yeah, so in the sort of a descending order. So 3, 2, 1, so 3 being the easiest, 1 being the hardest out of those first 3. And then sort of conveniently, 4 is middle, 5 gets a little bit harder, and 6 is definitely the hardest test we've got. So that's kind of nice in terms of like studying order. But it's still annoying because 6 is still not as hard as the real test, as far as we can tell. Obviously, well, not obviously. The 6, 5 and 6 only just came out like right after the real test happened. So there aren't that many students that have taken both. But of the students we have that have taken both, there are a lot of reports saying that 6 is still not quite as hard, but is a lot more close to what we'll actually see. Some other issues that happened besides just the fact that the test was a lot harder is that there were a lot of technology issues, including ones that we got like guarantees from the College Board that weren't possible. So there are a lot of things that we really need to make sure that we're doing to prevent those things from happening. The number one thing that we saw, like, and this was us, and this was a lot of our colleagues, is that iPads were just a total no-go. They were working, but as I have a little bit lower on the slide, the symbols weren't rendering process properly. There were lots of like parentheses that were left out. I had students talk about exponents just not being on the same, like being on the same line, looking like a normal number. So it is now like our official advice that no one should be taking this test on an iPad, unless there's nothing else they can take it on at all.
Worth noting that issues on the PSAT were most commonly on iPads as well.
Yeah.
That's 2 test dates now in the US, the digital PSAT and this March SAT, where iPads had consistently more problems than any other platform that you could take the test on.
We also saw some issues on school-issued Chromebooks. The Chromebooks were working at the schools where they were issued, but then a lot of times weren't able to connect to the Wi-Fi elsewhere. Maybe just like weren't being allowed access elsewhere. So unless you can use that, like go test the Chromebook at that school before the test happens, which is oftentimes not going to be possible, we'd also mostly recommend not using a school-issued Chromebook at some school that you don't go to. So taking at your own school, there shouldn't be any problems there. And actually, some schools are requiring that you use your Chromebooks, partially because it's nice to have it all be standardized. On the level, Macs had higher failure rates in general than PCs did, although this wasn't quite as like drastic as the iPads or the Chromebook situation. And we also did have some students that had some pretty serious accommodations issues. This isn't quite the same type of technology issue, but with the College Board just saying that they lost the accommodations, students just on the day not getting the time. I haven't heard of anyone that like showed up that day and was shocked to know that they didn't get the time, but I had several students personally that didn't get their extended time because the College Board like told them the day before they weren't going to get it. So really making sure that you're double, triple, quadruple checking with your school counseling office, as well as checking your paperwork. I mean, there's not really a lot to be done about this, but it is one of those things that it's better to know sooner than later so your student doesn't get there and totally freak out, which would be fair because it's not fair. But yeah. So just not a good situation overall.
And if I could just speak to the Mac issue quickly, one of the things we heard commonly reported was specifically that if a student might have been taking it on a Mac and the Apple ID associated with the device was a parent's Apple ID, sibling's Apple ID, and if they had to update or reinstall Bluebook or something like that on the morning of the test, maybe they don't know their parents' Apple ID and they don't have their phone with them or not on because they're in testing mode. They're not allowed to have their phone on or out with them. So that one thing I'd say is that if your computer is a Mac, I'm not saying go out and buy a new laptop, but parents, if it's your Apple ID on there, you need to share your password with your student for the morning of the test, just in case of any mishaps.
Absolutely.
Now, in general, with this test being a higher variance test, we saw higher volatility on the higher end of scorers. So in general, our students projected by the Bluebook practice tests into this 1100 to about 1350 range tended to score best relative to what we expected them to score based on Bluebook practice test results. Whereas the higher a student was scoring on Bluebook practice tests, the more mixed those results were, that things were just kind of less predictable at the high end based on the Bluebook practice tests. And that's again because a lot of the increased difficulty in the test was happening in the very most challenging questions, which make the biggest difference when you're going for that top end of the score range. So specifically in terms of how they made the math questions more complex. Tori, I'm going to let you handle this one.
Okay. So the official test was so basically when we have questions, they are using the same type of content, but they're trying to reorient the test a little bit to make Desmos, which is the calculator in the test, not quite as like universally useful. So when we very first were taking the test, and even in those like easier Blue Book practice exams like 3, 2, and 1, there are plenty of test questions where you can just straight up type in the entire question into the test, and if you know what you're looking for, you can just get the answer right away. What we're hearing from students, and that was in both the hard module and the easy module of those earlier Blue Book tests, what we heard from students is that on the second module of the real exam, this was essentially not possible on any of the questions. Still, Desmos was quite useful and it is like a really powerful tool, but there was a lot more like student thought that had to go into it. So as a math nerd, do I think that's good or bad? I think that's that's not a terrible thing, but it's definitely something that you really need to be watching out for and is kind of frustrating that was different than the Blue Book exam. Some ways that they were doing this were writing equations in terms of A and B instead of X and Y. So Desmos only knows how to graph something if the central variables are X's and Y's. So if there are no X's and Y's, it just will not graph it. So your student had to be able to figure out like where an X or a Y should go as opposed to the A or B. And equations were also a lot more disguised within word problems. So the SAT is kind of universally famous for their like kind of like tricky word problems. It's like definitely like a hallmark of the whole ordeal. But these word problems made the actual equations that you needed to type into Desmos if you were going to go that route significantly harder to find. So for the very hardest problems, it was mostly that you needed to get like Desmos maybe will get you 75% of the way there. It'll get you down the road, but it absolutely won't give you the answer. It's a lot more math that's needed to actually know. And also there's something
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. There's also something called superficial complexity. So problems that, if we go to the next slide, is a good example of this where like this is what we call a different, well, not what we call, but what is called a difference of perfect square problem. These two problems are essentially identical. Like there's literally not even one single more step that you need to do to solve either of these problems. But the second problem looks a lot more difficult because it's got a higher order. It's got additional variable, there's more stuff going on. So a student might look at that problem and assume they don't know how to do it, as opposed to that first problem, which they probably do know how to do, and they're the exact same problem. There's literally nothing more challenging about the other one.
Right. And it's about essentially the clarity that a student is going to need to tap into a specific piece of knowledge. So most students are going to be able to look at a squared minus 4 and say, I have a difference of squares. A squared is a perfect square and 4 is a perfect square. They're being subtracted, difference of perfect squares. So I know exactly how to factor this because I learned that it's going to be a minus 2 times a plus 2. Over here, you have a difference of perfect squares. 64a to the 16th is a perfect square. It's just less obviously a perfect square than a squared, which just has the exponent that tells you, oh, they're squaring it right away. So again, superficial complexity is something that they added into the test to slow students down. In other words, you don't need any deeper knowledge of math to be able to factor the equation on the left and the equation on the right. You just are going to maybe take a couple more seconds to identify what you actually need to do in both cases. And maybe in some cases fail to identify that, you know, the one on the right is a difference of squares sort of in disguise.
So they also did some of this making the reading and writing questions more complex. This is a little bit less straightforward than the math because we have heard sort of more variable accounts of this. What we do know fairly for sure is that they did increase the word count on average for the questions. So this version of the test, unlike the test that you guys probably took when you were teenagers, which had the long passages, this version of the test has short passages for every question. So on the Blue Book, a lot of these questions have the passages that are really short, only a couple of sentences, whereas on the test, we're hearing like even maybe there needed to be scrolling that occurs. So significantly longer, perhaps. We also heard some more mixed reviews on if the vocabulary level was higher. That's something that we do kind of hear about every test, but we did hear that more than average on this one. So that is something that we wanted to at least flag, is that the vocabulary was maybe a little bit more challenging as well.
Yeah, and it's worth clarifying that when we talk about student feedback on these exams, we hear feedback from students about every exam, and at least one student every test date will say that was the hardest test I've ever taken. That was way harder than any of the practice tests. We
Yes.
hear that, but on this test, we're hearing consistently from almost every student, from students who we know have, great judgment and mastery of the test content. We hear these things. So that's why we say we're very confident about what we've told you kind of so far. The higher vocabulary level on this test, though, was more, some students said yes, some students said no. So it's harder to say exactly, but it's likely the case based on what we
Yeah.
heard, but it was more mixed.
So
So,
first,
oh, go ahead.
sorry. For students with higher score goals, these hard level practice exercises to that more targeted practice is going to be extremely important. So you might be more used to taking a longer exam, and oftentimes that is what we recommend. But we are going to be shifting our advice a little bit to be doing some more targeted hard level practice, just because, as we've already said, the practice that we've got in the full length exams just isn't accurate for those full length tests. So it's better to be taking these really hard practices more seriously and more often. We do also give all of our students test innovators, which does have more difficult exams built in. We're still getting some feedback from some students that those tests still aren't as difficult as the real tests. So we're always evaluating new third-party exams. And also there are lots and lots of different third-party platforms if you're not one of our students, that you can have access to, or you can even get test innovators on your own. Also, the Blue Book tests are just not as accurate for Module 2 difficulty. So it's better to just know that in your heart when you're going into the test, and also know that when you're practicing. Um, you want to be practicing every time as if you're short of time. We've had some people sort of ask us if they should be shaving time off of their practice, like, oh, I'm going to take the test and just finish with 2 fewer minutes or 4 fewer minutes or something. That's probably not necessary, although perhaps could be a decent option for some students if you're finishing really, really quickly. But mostly what we're asking all students to do is really practice with as if every second is precious, because on real test day, it's most likely to be true.
Right. And the time difficulty, when we talk about it, it comes from the fact that you get the same number of questions and minutes in the easier or in the standard difficulty first module as you do in the harder second module. So for a student who's, excuse me, right on time in that first module, they're going to struggle for time in the second module because you're being asked to do the same number of questions, but at a higher difficulty level. So time management strategies are going to be super important, even for students who are not struggling to finish these practice tests on time, because of the variable difficulty between the available practice tests and the official test. So in terms of time management, we have a couple kind of good pieces of general advice that will help students stay on their timing checkpoints. So for the reading and writing section, we advocate essentially skipping to the grammar questions first. They tend to start around question 15, sometimes 14, sometimes 16, but around that area of the test. Now, the grammar questions are the fastest questions in the reading and writing section, because essentially, deciding whether something should be a period or a comma is going to take you much less time than the main idea of a paragraph, where you may have to read it through several times. You're going to have to read lengthy answer choices. The punctuation questions, verb agreement, transition words, they're typically going to be much faster questions. So the idea is that by knocking out all of those faster questions that come at about the halfway point of the section, you end up with a better sense of, okay, what's my actual time per question remaining now that I've answered X number of questions already? So it just gives you a better sense of your pacing for the remainder of the exam. In math, we advocate for all students to do a 3-pass strategy. And this is a way to take the math section to be cognizant of your time, no matter whether you need, to rush or not. Essentially, you're going to plan to run through that math section 3 times. And your first time through, You're going to answer every question that you definitely know how to do. You look at the question, you say, I know what I need to do here. I'm just going to execute. You do it now. While you're doing that, if you see a question that you think you can figure out, you're going to use the built-in Mark for Later tool in the Bluebook app to mark that question for later. Once you finish with all those questions you definitely know how to do and you've passed through the section once, you go back to your first question that you marked for later. This is your second pass through the test. When it's a question that you think you can figure out, but it's going to involve some figuring out, and you're not totally sure of the path to get all the way to the answer. But you think if you put the time in and start kind of calculating things out, plug some things into Desmos, write out some work, that you'll get there. And then the third pass through is going to be all of the questions that you just looked at. And I was like, I have no idea how to do this. And then so you just kind of start to try things and see if you can make anything make sense. You know, redraw the diagram in a way that might make more sense to you, or just start to try to simplify equations or plug it into Desmos and see what you can see. But, you know, you're not really sure at all of how to do it. You don't really even know the first step. Just try it a few different ways. So this 3-pass strategy guarantees that you run out of time for the things you were most likely to get wrong anyway. And that's the value of it. You give yourself time to answer every question that you essentially know you'll be able to get or have a strong chance of getting. And you run out of time for the things you were unlikely to get correct anyway. When we're in the harder second math module, the difficulty really spikes around question number 10. In the first math module, you have a full gradient from easy to medium to hard level questions. In the second math module, you basically have medium questions up to number 10, and then it's all hard questions for the rest of the test, more or less. And so basically you will be able to, you know, in other words, number, 22, the final math question, isn't necessarily harder for you than number 10. Because it's not like the ACT or the old SAT when we would expect the last question to be a lot harder than number 10. It's really just because everything is more difficult in that final module. You just don't know which ones are going to be the most difficult for you. And that's why this 3-pass strategy is so significant for students. The other thing that it's really important to note is that if this SAT really whooped you and you haven't yet investigated if ACT might be a better test for you, then you should absolutely try an ACT practice test. The ACT is a known quantity. There hasn't been a significant revision to the test since the 80s. And we have all of the practice tests that have been released going back to like 2008 in our Google Drive. And so this test is much more reliable. But this year, fewer students than ever actually opted to take the diagnostic ACT that we offer to students, because the digital SAT has a lot more sort of quality of life upgrades, a lot more bells and whistles. Namely, you can take it on a screen and it's fewer questions in less time. So, what student doesn't want to live on a screen and take a shorter test? I get it. I understand why they would have that preference. At the same time, despite being a longer test, the ACT is an easier test for many students. Not all. Some students do better on the SAT, and we, advise them to do that. But it is important that, students try both. And we had so many students that were gung-ho about the format of the digital SAT that they just wanted to go right into that without an ACT. And I would just say, a lot of them are kind of realizing maybe I should have taken the ACT a little more seriously once they saw the March results. The other thing to note is that the ACT remains the choice for the vast majority of students with learning disabilities and accommodations for testing. There are myriad reasons for that. We won't delve into all of them now. One of the obvious ones is they don't lose your accommodations, like happened to some students on the digital SAT. But we typically find that students with, learning differences and accommodations on the test are consistently going to improve more strongly on the ACT. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, the ACT has some breaking news that we thought it would be relevant to share here. Namely, they're getting more serious about offering a digital version. So the ACT as it stands right now is a paper test unless you get selected for a digital ACT pilot study. And so if you're taking the ACT this June, you'll be offered, you can be offered the option to take a digital version of the ACT. When you take this digital version of the ACT, half of the students who take it will be taking the same format of the ACT as the paper version, but on a computer. The other half will be taking a version of the ACT with fewer questions that gives them more time per question. And so this is the ACT basically testing out, can we make a more attractive offering like the digital SAT that is a shorter test that students can take on a screen? The pilot study is, it's tricky to decide whether you would really want to take it or not. But the one thing I would say is that call us for advice. I think for most students, the paper-based version of the ACT is just a stronger option. The ACT was designed to be a paper test. So there are certain things that just don't translate well to a digital format with the way that the standard test is designed. But there are, if you're a student where time is by far your biggest consideration for the ACT, then you may consider doing the digital pilot because there's a 50% chance that you'll get a shorter version of the test with more time per question. So it is worth considering if if that's your main consideration. But for any of our students, we are happy to set up a call to talk through, would it make sense for me to opt into this digital pilot or not?
So also these the test information release or the TIRs have changed a little bit for this coming year. So April, so the test is just in a couple of whiles. All of those tests will have a TIR if you pay for it. June, only Saturday testers are going to get a TIR release. September also is only going to be a Saturday test. That used to be one where we got all of them. December is also going to be just a Saturday test release. And then February is going to have everyone once again. So it's just really worth noticing that sometimes they will let you just pay for it even though it's not available, which is extremely annoying. I don't know why they do that, or I guess I do kind of know, but still frustrating. So just make sure that you've made note if it's actually available before you pay them like the $40 or whatever it is. They've also done something where they have committed to making a paper version available indefinitely to all students. So obviously we don't really know if that really is true, but that is what they have promised to everyone. So hopefully that is true. And it's just a really good test already that we know is good. So it's always a solid option for everyone. And we're glad that they've made that commitment just so that we don't have to be only relying on these digital tests that don't work for every student.
Yeah, and I want to be clear about when we talk about test information release, essentially what that means is you get a copy of the test that you took and a list of what questions you got wrong and what answer you selected for those questions.
Yeah,
So
it's
it's
a
really
really powerful
valuable for
tool.
students when they prepare. The digital SAT, you will never get a test information release. You will never be able to see what questions you actually missed. And the score report that gives kind of, the amount of points you lost by question type, it doesn't actually give the amount of points you lost by question type. It's very confusing and convoluted the way that the SAT actually reports scores by subdomains. So the ACT on these specific dates will give you much, much more information about your official test than you'll ever get from taking the digital SAT. So again, there are plenty of reasons a student would take the digital SAT, and that might be a better option for them. But it is important to know that there are some quality of life advantages to the ACT, even though it's not a shorter test and it's not on a screen. So our updated thoughts on SAT versus ACT. We have seen really since students took this PSAT that they have a huge preference for the digital SAT after trying both tests. The ACT is an uncomfortable experience because you don't have enough time per question and it's longer. So no student likes taking an ACT better, or very few students like taking an ACT better. That doesn't mean that they all score better on a digital SAT. It's just a more comfortable experience. Historically, the main kind of decision point for SAT versus ACT has been time. And that's because the ACT is a faster paced test. You have to do more in less time. And so the students that can handle that pacing are typically going to do better on the ACT because the trade-off of the ACT is that the questions are more straightforward. So you're able to answer sort of easier questions, but you have less time to do it. So the students who really struggle with that time limit are typically going to go to the SAT, and the students who can handle the time limit are mostly going to do better on the ACT. There is more that goes into it than that, but that's the biggest factor. However, now with this kind of new format of SAT that we're seeing, it is in some ways objectively easier to get the highest scores on the ACT. It's very common on the ACT for you to be able to miss questions and still get a perfect score. There was a test one April, maybe it was April 2021, where you can miss 13 questions across the test and still get a 36. And so what that means is that if you're a very bright student who's just prone to silly mistakes, the ACT is going to punish you a lot less for those silly mistakes than the digital SAT is likely to, because each question is going to have an outsized impact on your score on the digital SAT, whereas you can get away with a little bit on the ACT. And then I will say that for our younger students in here, for the time being, until we start to see a little more stability in SAT scores relative to what the Blue Book practice tests are predicting from students, we're going to be sort of breaking ties in favor of the ACT in terms of our recommendation. So let me be clear that we'll prepare your students, and we're well equipped to prepare students for either test. So if you really want to go SAT, absolutely, we're in your corner 100%. We've got a digital SAT program that Tori and I and our team have been building for 2 years. It is great. But our advice for most students who could kind of go either way and seem to be able to do equally well on both tests for the time being will be ACT, because of the fact that College Board hasn't given us practice tests that represent the difficulty of the actual SAT. All right, so what I have here are the remaining test dates, and I have this mainly, this is something that our juniors should be thinking about. The yellow test dates are the dates that are the final test dates accepted on each test for early action and early decision deadlines for colleges. So if you're applying early action or early decision anywhere, then you want to keep these dates in mind because they're your final chance at most schools. The red dates are the final regular decision deadlines. And I'm talking senior year fall, by the way, in case it wasn't clear. So you can take the test through December of your senior year if you are planning for regular deadlines. But for early deadlines, you need to be done by the September ACT or the October SAT. For sophomores, you have lots of flexibility. And basically, you would plan, if you have finished Algebra 2 and Geometry or the equivalent math at your school, if you have an integrated math curriculum, email me and I'll tell you what that actually means. If you just tell me what number integrated math you're in and what school you attend. But essentially, once you're finished with that Algebra 2 Geometry equivalent, then you're kind of ready to start your test prep. So if you're finished with that by the end of 10th grade, we recommend prepping over the summer before junior year and aiming to test for the first time early in the fall of junior year. The idea there is that, you're able to knock out your prep over the summer when you don't have as many competing responsibilities. And then also you kind of front load your test prep away from the spring of junior year, which the juniors in here could probably tell you is a pretty stressful and busy time. That you don't want to have to be worrying about test prep on top of all of your other responsibilities if you can avoid it. However, if you're taking Algebra 2 or Geometry or the equivalent math class at your school during junior year, then you actually do want to wait until the spring to test for the first time because you really need that math to be able to do your best on the exams.
So we have prepared this checklist for all of you and for the students for just things that you want to do like day of or the day before. Well, some of them are sooner than that. So number one is, especially if you're a junior, you want to be registering as soon as possible. Normally the May SAT date is not that popular. And normally we don't really recommend it even to that many students, but because people were kind of taken aback by their March SAT experience, way more people are signing up for it. So it's not kind of that normal lackadaisical experience where you can kind of sign up whenever you want. Definitely get on that as soon as possible. Another thing that's really important is to make sure that you've downloaded the app onto the testing device that you already are planning on using. And make sure that you have that and you tested using the system check, which is number 3, prior to test day. Almost everyone that I know that had issues with anything but the Wi-Fi, so that's everybody but those Chromebook people, who really there's nothing they could have done. Everybody that had an issue that did not do the system check. So really making sure that you're running the system check is really, really vital. Also print out your hall ticket. I think there was some confusion, not really with hopefully most of our students, but we saw this with colleagues. Because the test is digital, they assumed that they could have a digital hall ticket. That is simply not the case, and they will not let you in. So make sure that you print it out the night before, have it in your backpack. That's something you definitely need to bring with you. You also want to make sure that your device is charged the night before. Charging your device is something you can do. So you can bring your charger and you can bring, and I would definitely recommend bringing both the charger and an extension cord because there's no guarantee that your normal charger is going to be able to reach wherever it is you're sitting, and they probably won't let you rearrange the desks during the middle of the test. So that is a no-go, but you want to make sure that you're coming in with a full battery either way. And also you want to make sure that you're bringing a snack to eat during the break. That's just sort of typical SAT stuff. So make sure that your brain is fed and your body is fed so that you can have a great test day.
Yeah. A couple other things. Bring pencils for scratch work. It's a digital test, but to do well in the math section, you are going to have to write down steps. So you're given one piece of scratch paper as a default, which is kind of BS in our professional opinion. But you can ask for a second piece of scratch paper. So just to be clear, you are limited to 2 pieces of scratch paper front and back, which is going to be like a regular, what is it, 9 by 11 printer paper?
8.5 by 11, I think.
8.5 by 11. Thank you. I knew you'd have the exact measurements of printer paper. Yeah, so 8.5 by 11. So practice using 2 sheets of 8.5 by 11 printer paper as well. You can ask for that second piece of scratch paper, do it before you need it, or you may end up wasting valuable time on the test, tapping your foot with your hand in the air, waiting for the proctor to come over and give you that next piece of scratch paper. Then bring your physical calculator. In general, what we found with our students is that they find it faster to do calculations. Like if you had to do some, like 12 to the 14th power or something like that. You're not going to have to do that. But, any big number math, do it with your actual physical calculator. It's typically faster that way than typing it into Desmos. But actual graphing and some of the advanced functions of Desmos, obviously use the Desmos graphing calculator for that, because it just tends to be handier for graphing than a TI-84 or TI-89 style graphing calculator is. It's just a little more user-friendly, easier to adjust your zoom and your window and all of that. So other important things, if you have any technical problem at all, report it to the proctor. Basically, if you have a technical problem in your app and you try to proceed through the test, we've heard, horror stories of students basically responses not counting and them getting a 200 in the section, which is a 200 is the lowest score you can get on an SAT section. But if the proctor has certain admin control over every student in the room, so you may need the proctor to do something on their end. So any technological issue, even if you think you clicked through and fixed it, just flag it to the proctor and say, hey, I think I have a problem here. I just want to check with you. During the actual test, the Bluebook app is going to lock your computer screen so that you can't exit the Bluebook window. However, students can probably figure out how to exit the Bluebook window, but part of the software in Bluebook is tracking software. If you exit the Bluebook window, they're going to assume you cheated. So don't do anything that would possibly pull you out of the Bluebook testing window. We've heard stories of students getting the dreaded cheater letter. Hey, your scores have been canceled due to, irregularities or suspicious activity during the test. And it's believed that, maybe a student accidentally hit Control-Alt-Delete or something and opened the task manager, while taking the test. And that would be a way to allow you to actually navigate to another window or some kind of similar issue to that. So whatever you do, just do what you can to stay in the Bluebook window. If you find that you accidentally do something weird to get out of the Bluebook window, flag it to the proctor immediately. College Board already knows. It's not like you're ratting yourself out. They know immediately when it happens. When you submit your test, there's a whole log of your computer's activity. So you're not hiding it is not going to increase your chances of success. Flagging it to the proctor so that the proctor can say, student came right up to me, it was a non-issue. That's your best chance of success. So just over communicate rather than under communicate about anything technological on this test at all. Okay. With all of that said, we'll open it up to questions. I have a couple questions here already, and then we will basically, take any questions that anyone has. So one question we got, what is the net that our students would have performed better on average on the paper exam? So one thing I would say is that we don't have sufficient data to answer a question like this. I mean, we would need to see a student actually perform on a paper exam to know that. And the other thing that we don't know from one test sitting of the digital SAT officially is a student's range of outcomes. So when I mentioned that the digital SAT is a higher variance test, on any given day, no matter how well prepared a student is, their performance on the test is going to be predicted as a range of outcomes, right? They could score anywhere between this and this, right? And that range is going to increase on the low end if they didn't sleep well that night. And it's, so there are so many factors that go into one performance from a student that we'd really need a body of data on paper and digital tests. One thing I'll say is that based on what we've seen from students who took the test in December, took the test in March, most of the students did better, but they were also preparing in between. So they did better in March than they did in September. But of course, they're preparing between December and March to make that happen. So we don't have much data because we don't collect scores from students who don't work with us. So we don't know about the students who did nothing in between those two tests. So that's not really an answerable question, unfortunately. And I would also push back on the idea that students would necessarily do better on the paper test, because it's not the case that students would uniformly do better on one version of the test or the other. It's just the case that students who relied on the Blue Book practice tests to be a reliable indicator of the difficulty level of this test, which again, totally College Board's fault for not providing accurate practice tests, they were caught off guard by the difficulty of the test. But it doesn't mean that everyone would perform better on paper. All right. Then we have, given the limitations of the Blue Book tests, what would you recommend as the best way to prepare for the digital SAT? So we covered this a little bit on a previous slide. Tori, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, so especially for those harder modules, we would recommend doing a little bit more of that worksheet work. So the College Board released something called the Question Bank that has a lot of like College Board written questions. So these are like in that official format and they are like official questions, but they just aren't on the digital versions of the test, the digital versions of the practice tests that they have released so far. So we have those all for our students. They're all booked out by difficulty, and we're going to be assigning a lot of those. If you're not one of our students, those are on the College Board's website, so those are accessible. Also, just in general, using third-party resources and really trying to drill in on like every third-party resource pretty much has like them separated out into like easy, medium, and hard, or something along those lines. Really going and doing as many hard questions as possible to make sure that we're working on that together.
Yep. And one thing I can show you all is what the question bank looks like. So this is what it is. I'm going to drop this link in the chat for everyone. That's the URL. And essentially what the question bank allows for is you can find questions by choosing SAT, math. Okay, let's go with advanced math, search. And then we can even filter by the skill being tested. If you're struggling with parabolas, that's a nonlinear function. And maybe these equivalent expression questions. And you'll be able to We'll just click on a few questions. You can actually even filter it by difficulty. So let's just do hard questions and let's just do them in nonlinear functions. You'll get the list of questions and then you can pull the question up. It'll have the question on the left and an explanation of the answer on the right. So if you were to self-prep, this would be a super valuable tool for you to use. And this is what Tori was explaining without the demonstration. All right, let's get back to this slide. Now, next question. If a student's given the easier second module, what's their highest scoring potential? So it's unclear. And just to be clear, to run this now 6 Blue Book tests and to answer them with every possible combination so that we could see exactly how anything could play out on those tests, it would take an unrealistic amount of computing power. We wouldn't be able to do it, and neither would anyone else. So it's hard to say exactly in these cases, but I would hazard a guess in like the 500s, possibly as high as 600. But that would really have to be a perfect storm of like just barely testing into the easier second module and then acing it, which is just unlikely to happen. Another question, how did the March digital exam in the US compare to the prior year's worth of international digital exams? Great question. So essentially what we've seen and heard from our international colleagues is that the very most recent international exams, October and December were the last 2 international exams. There is no November SAT internationally. They were more similar to this March SAT in terms of their difficulty, which is why we believe that the official tests are going to continue on this kind of more difficult trajectory. I would say you really need, just like you need 3 points to know that you're creating a line, right? Any 2 points make a line. You need a 3rd point for it to be really a line. We needed a 3rd point to know that this increased difficulty was a longer term trend. And now that it's been October, December, and March in a row, it's clear to us that it's likely to continue that way. Tori, you can take this next one.
Yeah. So we actually tested out, like we spent like the last, I think as Jim has sort of mentioned a couple of times, we spent like the last 2 years and more concentratedly like the last 18 months, like really checking like every single that we could find, at least specific website and third-party practice that we could find. We really preferred Test Innovators, and so that's why we went for that with our students. I think that the questions seem like they are the most similar to the test in terms of difficulty. And they have like a really, really fantastic set of worksheets on like every topic, including it's really difficult to make really good verbal worksheets, and their verbal worksheets are like impeccable. So that's why we decided to go with Test Innovators. There are some other ones that are like really excellent for different things. So if you have like kind of a more specific question, like absolutely shoot us an email and we can make a more specific recommendation. But right now we would definitely say the Test Innovators is our preference.
In addition to the question bank that we just
Oh
showed.
yeah.
Those
Yes.
would be the 2 best resources as far as we're concerned. That's why they're what we use with our students. Next question. How different is prep for ACT versus SAT? Would you ever recommend a student to study and take both SAT and ACT? And how much extra prep would that be? Great question. So how different is the prep? Structurally, we present it the same way, meaning weekly meetings with the tutor about the same time frame. You're doing practice. You're getting specific feedback on the areas that you're showing you have problems with based on the practice. So structurally, they are the same. In terms of how different they are, there are certain topics that show up more on one test than the other, certain topics that show up on one but not the other. Same with question types. I would say in the past, they were about 80% the same. Now they're probably more like 70, 65% the same, because this new digital SAT has diverged a little more from the ACT. It also depends on where you are in the sort of score curve. Because if you're, for some students, the best way to improve at this test is to just get better at grammar and algebra. And if that's really where you are, then it's not that different at all, because grammar's still grammar and algebra is still algebra, right? But if you're really trying to fine tune in the high ranges, then you really want to be doing test specific practice and learning to present things in exactly the way that you're going to see them on the test. Would I recommend a student study for and take both? I think students at the very high end should consider that more than others. For most students, I wouldn't recommend doing both. I would recommend getting yourself a diagnostic score on both and then making an informed decision about which one to really invest time and possibly money into prep for. That tends to be the wisest way to do it. But for some very high scoring students, it can make sense to just try for both tests, because at the end of the day, you just need to have your best day on the right day. And trying it on 2 different tests can increase your chance of getting that score. So that's what I would say. Another question. As a student who has scored high in the past on the SAT and would be in that higher volatility range, which means above 1500 according to our slide, would you recommend switching to prep for the ACT or continuing to work on the SAT? I would recommend, beyond a shadow of a doubt, trying a practice ACT. Try a practice ACT and see how you score. If you're scoring the same or better as you are on your SAT, then it could make sense to switch. If you score much worse, then stick with the SAT, obviously. But you're not going to know until you try. So we will send out a diagnostic ACT to everyone who's in here, so that any juniors who want to try the ACT and see if they might want to shift gears for the June or July ACT can do so. And if you just send us a picture of your answer sheet, we'll grade it. If you send us your SAT score history, or if we already have it because you're our student, of course, then we will compare those and make a recommendation for you. But really, the only way there is no crystal ball. If I had the SAT versus ACT crystal ball where you didn't have to actually take a practice test, I'd be making much more money, because that'd be a super valuable thing to be able to tell students without them having to actually try practice tests for both. But unfortunately, the only way is to truly actually sit down and try both tests and see how you do. So I wish I had an easier answer, but I don't.
Alas.
Yeah. All right, that covers all of our questions for today. So thank you all so much for joining. If you have specific questions or want to talk about your student's plan, these QR codes in the upper corner are a contact form from our website. So you can put your information in there and we'll be able to give you a call tomorrow and talk through a plan that makes sense for your student. And we'll send out an email with a practice ACT and the recording of this webinar definitely by Wednesday. So look out for that. And then if you have any other questions, let us know. I see we have one final one in the chat. I heard some students take subject tests for the SAT individually, but I'm not sure what it means. The SAT, there used to be these tests called SAT subject tests. So if you're looking up information on SAT subject tests on the internet, you might find something that talks about them. They haven't existed for several years now. So that is not true. There are no SAT subject tests anymore. No student has to take them or worry about them ever again. All right. Thanks again for joining. Hope you all have a great night, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.